And if you like, you can go ahead and drop your name, organization, or city in the chat so we can see everyone who is joining us today. Okay, perfect. So we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all again for joining us for our June webinar titled Rewriting the Narrative on Addiction Using Storytelling and Person-First Language. So a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded and a copy of the presentation will be available on the Georgia Recovers website. All attendees will be muted, and please use the Q&A panel on the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. The chat will also be available for general commentary, but it will not be moderated as closely. The interpreter will remain spotlighted throughout the webinar, and to adjust your view and see all speakers and panelists, click view in the top right corner of your screen and then select speaker or gallery. Users can also select the side-by-side view. Okay, and then our agenda. So we're going to go over an overview of the Georgia Recovers campaign. We will introduce our speakers. We will then have a moderated discussion, and then we will wrap up with a question and answer portion of the webinar. So starting off with Georgia Recovers. So Georgia Recovers is an evidence-based public health campaign aimed to reduce the prejudice and discrimination associated with substance use disorder in Georgia. The campaign is brought to you by DBHDD and builds off of the pivotal work of the Georgia Council for Recovery. So our goals and objectives include increasing knowledge about substance use disorder and that recovery is not only possible, but probable. We hope to improve attitudes towards those living with and or in recovery from substance use disorder and strengthen the capacity of stakeholders, including organizations and individuals already responding to the crisis. So next we have our 3 pillars of work, including community connection, story sharing, and education. So Georgia Recovers connects with community organizations across the state. Our CIC, or Community Impact Committee, also guides the direction of the campaign. We also collect and share stories of people impacted by substance use disorder, and these stories are shared across all of our social media channels. The campaign also changes attitudes by promoting messaging that speaks to hope and recovery, and we host monthly webinars to shed light on topics related to substance use disorder. So feel free to connect with us on our social media websites, Instagram and Facebook at GA Recovers. Also, feel free to complete our community partner form, which will be added in the chat sometime during the webinar. Okay, and on to our speakers. First, we have Brian Kite. Brian Kite is the program manager for Recovery Community Organization Development at the Georgia Council for Recovery. He is a certified addiction recovery empowerment specialist and has been trained in intentional peer support, medicated assisted treatment specialist, and as a whole health action management facilitator. In his role at the council, Brian has helped numerous communities around the state of Georgia organize focused conversations around recovery to create recovery community organizations, or RCOs. He provides technical assistance and coordinates continued training opportunities for the existing RCO network of over 40 RCOs and facilitates monthly learning collaboratives for all organizations within the network. Most importantly, Brian is a person in long-term recovery. Brian and his son, Henry, reside in Grant Park in the city of Atlanta, enjoy creating art. Next, we have Dr. Steve Delisi. Dr. Delisi is board certified by both the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and the American Board of Addiction Medicine. Before joining the Your Path team as Chief Medical Officer and President, Dr. Delisi has served as a psychiatrist for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation from 2005 to 2023. During his time with Hazelden, Dr. Delisi most recently served as Medical Director for Enterprise Solutions. Dr. Delisi continues as an adjunct faculty member of the Hazelden Betty Ford Graduate School. Dr. Delisi is a nationally recognized leader, speaker, and consultant on the use of evidence-based integrated treatments for co-occurring and substance use disorders, as well as the risk conferred by the epigenetic effects of adverse childhood experiences and trauma. And next we have our very own Jody McIntosh. Jody is a dynamic public health leader with an extensive history working with underserved and marginalized populations. As the director of the community engagement for the National Stigma Initiative at Shatterproof, she provides oversight and strategic execution of statewide community engagement efforts in Georgia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania to amplify campaign messaging and ultimately generate measurable shifts in addiction discrimination reduction. And I will pass it over to Jody to moderate our discussion.
Thank you, Jayla. Good afternoon, everyone. So excited to be here. And thank you again to Brian and Dr. Delisi for joining us. I'll give a moment for us to get pinned to the screen so that everyone can see. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to kind of ease our way into this conversation today. So before we get started, I'd like for Dr. Delisi and Brian to kind of talk a bit more about their personal experience to this work. And then we'll start going into how stigma contributes to marginalization. So Brian, how about we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Jody. As mentioned, my name is Brian Kite. I am a person in long-term recovery. And for me, it means it's been over 8 years since chaotic drug use or alcohol use has controlled the way that I live my life. Today, recovery is much more than just not using drugs or alcohol. It's about being a present father for my 9-year-old son, Henry. It's about being able to show up for the rest of my family and friends, a better uncle, better brother, a better family member overall, a better community member, and a full-time employee for the Georgia Council for Recovery. Recovery has really just transformed my life. It's about a new life, a better way of living. And over the past 8 years, and really before that, my recovery journey kind of began earlier on when I first went to treatment at the age of 17 after being in active use for a while. But I went to treatment and got out and continued on a journey that brought me into some places that I didn't think that I would go, in some more situations with active drug use that were very difficult and hard for me and anyone that loved me. And so that definitely played a factor into my experience of what stigma looked like in a lot of different ways, from myself personally, from my family and loved ones, from the different systems that I ended up becoming a part of, whether that was being incarcerated or trying to find gainful employment, because I ended up in a little bit of a cycle where I was in and out of incarceration, in and out of treatment for over a period of about 10 years before something clicked. And I'll say that it began with some positive messaging that came from a little bit of an unexpected place, I would think, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But for myself, yeah, how does stigma contribute to my life in recovery today? Well, it played an impact of why maybe I didn't get into recovery as early as I would have liked to. And then it also plays an impact in why I continue to do this work today. And I'm so adamant about trying to help more people get and stay well, because I'm tired of going to funerals, of hearing of sad stories of people that were great individuals, wonderful people, and their lives being cut short. And oftentimes, I'm not saying that it's the one key to fix all problems, but it's a way that we can begin to change some of these stories and hopefully have some different and better outcomes for the people that are a part of them.
Thank you so much for sharing, Brian. And you have a little fan club going here in the chat. I don't know if you're seeing that, but you have a ton of fans there. Dr. Delisi.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. Yeah, I myself am not someone in long-term recovery. I come into this work with personal and family history on the mental health side with depression and anxiety. But I have been in the field now for over 20 years. I've been able to work alongside individuals like Brian and the Georgia Council and Neil Campbell, seeing the power of the wisdom of lived experience to break down the barriers. Those barriers are well known to me. I have seen how difficult it is for the individuals who are trying to seek treatment and their families to push through the barriers developed by stigma and caused by stigma. It results in very real discrimination, and that's why it's so exciting to be participating in activities such as this to open the dialogue. It has really just been in the last, say, 8 years that we're even talking about it, and only in the last 3 to 5 years where we really start to see some true movement. I've also seen the stigma borne out with colleagues who had their own issues with substance use and were not able to seek the care that they needed because of stigma and the fear that stigmatization leads people to hide. And I've sat with family members who have lost loved ones. And quite honestly, at this point in my life, I can no longer stay quiet and participate in a system that remains stigmatizing to some of the most courageous and strong people that I have ever met. So it's truly my pleasure, and I'm humbled to be a part of today. So thank you, Jody.
Yeah, so very well put. And you both have kind of already touched on this, but in what ways does stigma manifest at different levels? I know, Brian, you brought us through a quick overview of your story, but I'm sure there are different ways it looked different at different parts of your journey, and maybe even still today.
Yeah, I did that a little intentionally and gave it a little space to dive a little deeper now. So like I said, I began my alcohol and drug use in my high school years from 14, 15, 16 into 17. And I ended up getting arrested for the first time at the age of 17. I didn't get to graduate high school with the rest of my friends. And I ended up being in treatment at that period of time. And so that was one piece already that I began to feel a little different when there were opportunities to meet and engage with friends again. I was already being looked at a little bit differently, and that eventually probably led to the reasons sometimes I was in active drug use, so I can understand why there may not have been invitations to weddings or other things that my, graduations from college and et cetera, other friends participated in, but also family functions. That became a little bit of a thing. Why even invite Brian if he's probably not going to show up in the first place, or do we want to see him? And I know my family members wanted me there. I think wanted a different version of a Brian that they at least thought that they knew. And then systemically, as I began to become entangled with our, I want to say justice, our criminal justice system, that I got familiar with some stigma in that regards, or what it portrayed itself as when it was dealing with probation officers or judges. It became apparent, I think, that individuals that actively used or engaged in drug use, at least from certain people's eyes, were not. I think that they saw the negative side of things a lot, and not to hear some of the positive light that came from some stories. And so I felt and saw that. And one other thing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention too is, well, I think Steve and myself both know that we are two white men here talking about some of this. And so I know also that while I was in some of these settings, especially being incarcerated, that I witnessed a difference and a disparity in the way that I was able to seek out and receive some opportunities, as opposed to other people of color that didn't get to. And I think it's for a variety and a myriad of different reasons. Some of it may have been because of societal things, culturally, but also just because of the system itself that was in place. And it was unfortunate. I saw that before I was incarcerated in certain settings when I got involved with law enforcement, especially when I was with a friend that was, two different situations where I was with a Black friend, that they were treated a little bit differently in a setting where I was maybe driving. They were asked to get out of the vehicle first and dealt with. And so I see how stigma manifests itself at these different levels. I've seen it and experienced it. And one thing that I'd really just, what really stands out with me is the initial conversation that may have, where I see somebody that's maybe been using drugs or has that history of a past, that tries to tell a part of their story, the reasons why. And there's just maybe an apathetic look or a checking out that happens without that further opportunity to engage in conversation. And I think that that's the piece that we really need to work on, is being able to just allow somebody to tell part of their story, so that we have a better understanding of where they're coming from and why they're in a place that they're in.
Great points, Brian. I mean, especially around the intersectionality of where the stigmatization of substance use disorders intersects with the broader societal discrimination and marginalization of peoples of color. And when you have that intersection, you see the grave disparities that we're seeing when you look at data such as overdoses. That is not at all equitably distributed across our population for the very reasons that you're talking about. And that's I think one of the best ways to identify societal and structural stigmatization and discrimination. The other level of stigma to bring up here, though, is at the level of the self. And how the societal messages around the stigmatization of use disorders becomes internalized. And that internalized stigma is experienced with the profound shame that people who have substance use disorder and their loved ones experience. And I've seen that time and time again. It's again part of what makes people stay in the shadows. And right at the moment where human connection, attachment is so important, it drives people to distance themselves, and it creates systems of care that distances and puts a space between them and us. And as any of us who have the wisdom of lived experience or who have worked in this field know, one of the most potent ways to address substance use disorders is with relationship, real human attachment. And self-stigma often creates a wedge between individuals right at the time when that human attachment is so critically important.
Can I
Yes.
say something to that
Sure.
before we jump to our next question? Steve, I really appreciate you mentioning that. I think it's not only important to realize that before people are seeking help in treatment opportunities, but even for myself now at 8 years in recovery, about 4 years ago, I made a decision to try to pursue higher education. And because of some of my background, that was stopped short initially. I think that if I was dedicated and pursued further, that I'll make that happen, and I still intend to. But part of the shame that I don't necessarily think it's necessarily even the shame, but it's the feeling of it doesn't matter how hard I try or how much I've accomplished, that there's still these systems in place or these people that won't give me an opportunity because of my past. And so one of the universities that I applied for didn't give me an opportunity because of the criminal background that I had. And, I know that when someone's seeking this, what I want to do is just have a conversation, that connection that you were talking about, to build the relationship so that we can move forward together, instead of them seeing a piece of paper or something come across their desk and say, no, next. And so that those systematic things that we need to change, I think, are really important to help reduce that self-stigmatization that continues to happen and unfortunately won't allow some of us to get to that potential of thriving or that we wish to truly be at. So thank you.
Yes, thank you both for sharing that. And I think it goes back to kind of how we started this conversation today, with being very intentional about talking about how you relate to the space. And in your introduction, it was so much more than I'm a person in recovery. It's like all these other aspects that make up who you are. And that's really what we're trying to get across, is that it's not just about the recovery, but it's about that journey and that full person. Going into the next question, you just talked about some of the things we can do to kind of reduce this stigma. How can we leverage scientific knowledge in our efforts? And I'll ping it to you, Dr. Delisi, first, and then Brian, if you have anything afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Jody. And I think we've got a slide to go along with some of our response here. Fundamentally, when you think about any medical condition that is highly stigmatized, two internal biases are often seen at the core, and they are cause and control biases. And what I mean by that is, if someone is seen as having actively caused their condition, it will be more highly stigmatized. And if there is a perception that someone should be able to control the behaviors that contribute to the ongoing medical condition, that too becomes stigmatized. And this is not true just for substance use disorders, although you can see on this slide how substance use disorders are on the high end of perceived fault or cause and high perceived control. And so you see them towards the right side of the slide, as compared to something like pediatric cancer, where a child is not seen as having caused their cancer or having any control over it. That's the far left side. But most of our chronic illnesses have some degree of these internal biases that contribute to the stigmatization. The other thing that I want to point out is that prescription opioid use disorder and heroin use disorder are the same thing. Yet there is a difference in the perception of stigmatization of those based upon cause and control. Now, the exciting part, and I am kind of a neuroscience geek, part of my role here today, is that we have science finally catching up and being able to show and help us to understand that these cause and control biases are false. We now know that when someone has a substance use disorder, and even before they ever pick up a substance, there are differences in the functionality of different areas of the brain. In the very center of the brain are our emotions, the reward center, our more instinctual drives. And those can be somewhat overactive even before someone has exposure to an addictive substance. But once that exposure occurs, it hijacks that part of the brain. Now, what's the difference between someone who has a higher risk of a substance use disorder based upon their genetics or those epigenetics? And what that means is, how does the environment, how do our life experiences, how do those adverse childhood experiences, how do those traumas, how do the historical and generational traumas that are so prevalent across our country, how do they affect this increase in risk that we all know about? And part of that has to do with the very front part of the brain, which is wired to regulate that deeper part of the brain. And when that deeper part of the brain is exposed to an addictive substance, that front part of the brain, when fully operational, will say, hey, wait a minute, that's not the most important thing for our survival. Because that instinct and drive, that's for survival, not for pleasure. Too often we talk about substance use disorders and the reward pathway being about pleasure. That is not accurate. It is about well-being and survival, which is also why these brain areas are so important in that human attachment and relationship that Brian and I have both been talking about. Human attachment and relationships and love activate this reward center, and that's why it's there, for those natural rewards. But alcohol and other addictive substances will hijack that. And if the front part of the brain does not regulate that fully, there is an increased risk of developing a use disorder way before the exposure. So this idea that, well, the person had a choice to use in the first place, not accurate. Not choice in the way that we think about it. And that individuals such as myself, who has a lower risk of developing a use disorder, has in terms of that exposure. The fact of the matter is that in the United States, almost the entire population has been exposed to addictive substances. So what's the difference? And in science, and the science of genetics, epigenetics, and how these different brain regions work, really clarify that there are these differences. And it speaks to individuals it's not about fault or control. It's about these known neurobiological realities that are part of the disease of substance use disorder. And I hope that helps people who are listening to understand that the science is catching up. The final thing that I will say, though, is that knowledge and science, even if you came to my graduate school class and it'd be 2 hours on all of this, just this, that knowledge alone does not really change attitudes and behaviors. It's combining that knowledge and the science with the wisdom of lived experience and the stories that Brian can share with a group. And so always there has to be both the science and medicine coupled with the wisdom of lived experience. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Steve. I'll go ahead and chime in. I'm no doctor, but I'm a little bit of a geek myself. So I definitely appreciate this information, as well as the information that I received when I went to my first treatment, which was 90 days, or the other treatment I went to, which was for 6 months. And I retained a lot of that information, and it was helpful, just as this is helpful. I think the other piece to know that would have been really important for me, so that I didn't continue the self-stigmatization or the stigma that I may have experienced from family members and loved ones unintentionally, was that after I went to treatment, that just because I had this information, or they received some of this information, that didn't fix everything, and that I wouldn't be able to just move on immediately. And when I didn't and had setbacks, you know, it was hard for me to gather around what was going on. Why couldn't I just get right? And having some better understanding of some of this information about the neurobiological, the genetics, epigenetics that Dr. Delisi was talking about, I think is very important, coupled with, as he said, the stories and the lived experience, and understanding that it takes time for my brain to heal, for me to get back into a place of somewhat homeostasis, or at least a better place that I can move quicker along my journey towards recovery. So I think that was really important for me to understand, is that it takes time, and there are still those predispositions that if something happens, I'm at a higher chance of having a setback than I would have been otherwise. And so I just need to continue to make those connections and relationships with those other people that have those lived experience and the stories, so that I can know what are my better chances, what are the better odds for me to make it through this day, so that I can get to where I want to be.
Boy, that's so important, Brian. Thanks so much for bringing that piece up. It's so important what you have just shared, and it's also important. I want to make sure that for people, with us today, the biology speaks to some increased risk, not predestination. So the science is one part, but it doesn't mean that if you're listening today and you have a family history, or you've experienced childhood adversity or trauma through your life, there's increased risk, but positive life experiences, resiliency, human attachment, connection, having a caring family or community around you can mitigate that risk. So I also want to balance the science with hope, because the hope is real. I also wanted to, if I may, Jody, just answer a bit of a question that I saw in the chat, in terms of the additional layer of stigma that can exist for individuals who are pursuing their healing pathway to recovery utilizing medications. And often the medications that we use for opioid use disorder or alcohol use disorder have in and of themselves a stigma against them, as if being on those medications, they're not, in quotes, really in recovery. And that's too where science can refute those biases. The medications that we utilize for use disorders, when prescribed specifically for a use disorder, are not substituting one drug for another. And in fact, in the brain, they're not doing the same thing as a substance that is used in an addictive manner. That's true even for substances that have some potential for misuse. There are ways that we mitigate that risk, and when taken as prescribed in the brain, they are not acting in the same way as an addictive substance. So I just wanted to kind of answer and speak to that additional layer of stigmatization. As a physician, that's certainly something that I know well, and especially as one of the older docs. I came into this field as a psychiatrist during a time where pretty much any medication that I would offer a patient was seen as interfering with an individual's recovery, rather than seeing it as an additional tool to their healing and recovery. And good news is that we're making progress, and we've come a long way in the 2 decades that I've been in practice. But I certainly have personally felt that stigmatization, and I've seen the hurt that it can convey to people who their pathway to healing includes medications.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for touching on that. I think anybody who's been in this space or worked in this field for any number of years has experienced that stigma or seen that stigma against folks who use medication for opioid use disorder or alcohol use disorder. And so it's wonderful to hear you kind of explain the science behind it, but also bringing in some of those other things, the social determinants of health and how that also impacts us, and that social connection on the positive end. So going into our next question, how can the use of person-first language shift ideas of cause and control when related to individuals with SUD? So we heard you, Dr. Delisi, kind of show us that first graphic, which a lot of people seem to have really loved that kind of visual. But when we use person-first language, how does that kind of shift that whole thing?
I can start from the perspective of, again, the health professional and how important it is for those of us in this field and for individuals who are allies in wanting to advocate and support people who have a substance use disorder, that we always put their personhood first. Again, and Brian can speak with more authenticity about the recovery community and the language that recovery community uses. But as a health professional and as allies of individuals with substance use disorders, it is always important to put the person first. And so the individual is not an addict. The individual is the person. So let's say it's Jim. This is Jim who has a substance use disorder, not Jim the addict. Does that make sense? It's really important that the personhood comes first. And we've done this better in other branches of medicine, which led the way in terms of person-first language. So rather than talking about the diabetic, it's Sue who has diabetes. Or rather than talking about Andy, the schizophrenic, it's Andy who has schizophrenia. Substance use disorder in this field it was slower to adapt because of the stigma and biases, which led to society seeing Jim who has a use disorder, just seeing Jim as his disease. And so it's really, really important to stress person first language. And anyone listening today who wants to be an active ally in this area, that's one of the most potent things that you can help with.
Brian, do you want to share your perspective? I know there's some nuances when it comes to the type of language that is used amongst the recovery community.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry if I'm glitching for just a moment. I got some unstable connection.
I'm
Here,
hearing,
but I will do my best to keep moving forward. So I think that it's important. It's so important as I was able to go through training to be a certified addiction recovery empowerment specialist. I think that really helped open my eyes. So what I mean by that is I was able to experience and hear about the multiple pathways to recovery, that comes to using medication to support individuals' recovery. I was at that time only used to going to some meetings that were 12-step based or in the faith community, and didn't have a grasp on the understanding that how broad recovery really was. And I think to the detriment only that's caused some of this cycling to continue. And I think what we just need to reiterate again is that the person comes first. And so eliminating some of the information that you are stop trying to prevent us from using some of the language that we have here on the right side, like addict or alcoholic. And again, that's we don't want to label people in general in other areas. So why are we doing it? The disease or the addiction itself afterwards. And I am not my then just addiction. The person itself, right, when they're first in contact with that moment of, am I breaking up?
Yeah, you're breaking up. It was okay in the beginning and it was starting to get a little bad, but I think we got the gist of most of what you were saying. If you want us to come back to you, maybe.
Is it a possibility that we pull the slide down? And I'm not sure if that'll help my connection at all.
Yeah,
we can try.
that's worth trying. Brian, I'll just slip in for a little bit and see if your connection stabilizes. The one thing that I thought I could speak to as well on that slide was the shift in language from relapse. And again, having been around for the past couple decades, when I started, I would always talk about people relapsing and that they would be a relapser. And when you step back and you listen, I am making it about the person. The action is on the individual. That individual relapsed. And it goes further to say that individual relapsed on X, Y, or Z. And that language goes back to the cause and control biases. By calling someone a relapser, I am strengthening the implicit biases that they have cause and control of this illness versus identifying it for what it is, which is a reemergence of symptoms of what is often a chronic illness. We don't talk about relapse when people are in treatment for high blood pressure. What we talk about is the reemergence of increased blood pressure, and then we change treatment. And studies have been done by Dr. Tom McClellan that shows that the reemergence of symptoms across multiple chronic illnesses, including substance use disorders, are actually not different. but we think about them differently. We don't typically talk about someone with high blood pressure as a relapser. We adjust their treatment to address their illness. And we talk about their symptoms coming back. That's how we need to talk about substance use disorder. And so now, in the second half of my career, when I'm working with someone who continues to have a return to use of substances, I identify that as the continued reemergence of symptoms of their chronic use disorder, and we address that as part of their treatment plan. So just wanted to share that as another thing. And I've seen how potently that changes how people view themselves, because now their health professional is not calling them a relapser. And so they think about it differently. It helps with the blame and the guilt and the shame, because they start to think about themselves as not a relapser. Their family members think about it differently. And then I can speak truly that it has changed how I see and relate with the individuals that I care for. It's changed how I relate with them. And so again, that power of language. So hope
I'm
Brian,
hardwired in now. Hopefully I've got a stronger connection. I apologize for that. Just to dovetail on some of what you said, I know I probably missed a little bit of my point, but I think that Steve, you're right on there. It's so important not only just to hear that piece, but to also what it does is internalizes and begins to change the people that are providing services, and then overall the systems at large. I think that we've seen that in our Northeast Georgia health system from the doctors and the nurses that are able to engage and work with recovery coaches on a daily basis now, changing some of the language that they were used to using, so that they can now witness and see the positive light of recovery. And it's been awesome to see how those nurses share about their recovery coaches. They are very attached to them now, and it's been an awesome thing to see. And so I think, just as you touched about, whether it's clinicians or counselors or doctors or probationers, whatever it is that if we're using language that promotes that person first, and we are creating an opportunity for that connection to take place. I shared initially that my interaction with recovery this time, what engaged and started that journey, well, I was incarcerated for probably, I don't know, it might have been the 12th time. And I called my mom and my dad and we had a conversation. Hey, we love you, Brian. We'll put some money on your books. And then a couple weeks later, I called home and my mom said that, hey, your grandfather wants to come see you. And I found out my uncle was going to be going with him. My uncle was already in recovery and had kind of taken a standpoint that he would engage with me when he could. But what we crave so much is that connection. And when my grandfather came to see me, all he could say to me was that, I don't know what to tell you aside from that I love you. And that was enough for me to hear from somebody that I didn't think was thinking about me at that time, to say that they saw me and they wanted well for me. And that was the spark that I needed to take that next step forward. And I'm so grateful for him and his desire to do that, because that helped me engage with my uncle when he had that conversation with me afterwards about some of the potential next steps that we could take. And then moving forward with my probation officer and the sober living and the next steps and to where I am today is just tremendous. And I think that it's a lot of different things, but I'll always go back to that moment where my grandfather just looked at me and said, I love you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Brian. That's so powerful. I want to be cognizant of time. We have about 10 minutes left. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, or maybe there's just one question in the Q&A now. Maybe you've answered the others. or we continue with the moderated questions. Y'all let me know which one you'd prefer. I think the next question is pretty important about advocating. Okay, so the next question is about how do we advocate for increased awareness and share personal stories of recovery? And how can these actions contribute to reducing stigma and promoting understanding?
I'll just build off of what I was just saying. I think that a lot of what we said leads into that, why these actions can contribute. I think we've shared on a lot of that, but why it's so important for those actions to take place, for that advocacy to happen, is we want legislation, we want laws or things that may seem discriminatory in action because of stigma to be changed. And how does that happen? Well, we take that scientific knowledge, we take the information that Dr. Delisi was touching on, and we take the lived experience of people that are living in recovery today, and we go. And that's where I was at just a couple weeks ago. I was in DC at the Capitol, sitting down with our congressional representatives from Georgia, having conversations about these things, these systematic things that we need to change, and sharing the lived experience of recovery together so that hopefully those individuals can see the light differently than they did previously and make positive changes for us that will impact thousands and thousands of lives.
Well said, Brian. And all what I would add, Jody, is that those of us who are looking to be advocates and strong, active allies in this space, we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with Brian and share our stories and what we've seen, and the disparities and the intersectionality between the stigmatization of this illness and other discrimination across our country. We have to raise our voices alongside. It is not fair, and it is not right for the individuals who are experiencing this illness to do this alone. And our voices together are what can have the impact. The example that I like to provide again to broaden how we're thinking about this is how advocacy and allyship has moved forward with cancer. And we see the cancer campaigns and what that has done at the societal, institutional, and personal levels. And that took courageous people who were suffering with cancer to stand up and share their story, and their allies and advocates. So, Brian, it's been my honor and my privilege to stand alongside you today. And I appreciate you, and I see and hear you.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate any of the allies that can come along on this recovery movement. And just as I am an ally for the movements in some other spaces that are directly impacted by the recovery movement, like standing with people of color and, for instance, the LGBTQ plus community. We had a recovery symposium just under 2 weeks ago in Athens, Georgia, for the LGBTQ plus community. And it was important for me to be there to see and hear the stories of those individuals, for me to see the impact that they have seen because of stigma and in turn discrimination, so that I can stand up and say, like, no, that's not right. I need to be a better ally. I need to be here. And it wasn't until I hear some of these stories that my willingness to make an impact and develop those relationships with those people too in hand. So spending time, seeking out opportunities where I can engage and have those conversations with people that may look or live differently than me, I think is really important. And so one other step that I would take as far as taking some strategies is having those conversations, seeking out opportunities where you can break bread with people. And another thing is stay connected. I saw Jayla drop in the chat, join a part of the campaign, be a part of the campaign, follow us on social medias, learn how you can take those next steps in advocacy or participating at these recovery events so that you can help share the word that recovery is possible and that there's more information that can be provided. You want to have more conversations. That's what it really takes, is having conversations about in situations like these where we can educate and share those stories of lived experience.
Thank you both so much. There's nothing else to say. That was perfect. Thank you for allowing me to be able to moderate this super, super powerful discussion. I'm so excited for all the folks who are able to show up and hear this, and the many more folks who will listen to this on social media. I'm going to pass it back over to Jayla to close us out.
Yes, thank you all so much. This was an amazing webinar, very, very informational. And it's great to see everyone engaging in the chat and being so engaged throughout. So we do have 4 more minutes. So we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions in our Q&A. So I want to get to that. But starting off, I know we talked a lot about empowering people to share their stories. And so how can individuals with lived experience be empowered to share their stories safely and effectively?
Brian, do you want to lead that one?
You kick us off. Maybe I'll round it out.
All right. Well, I think that the first is to know without any hesitation that your story needs to be heard and that your story should be heard. I would also encourage people to seek out resources that are available across this country in learning how to tell your story in a concise and compelling manner. Some people are just natural born storytellers, and others could benefit from learning some ways to do that. And so I just want to make sure that people are aware of that. So let your story be heard and work on creating a compelling version of your story. The other thing that I would add is a cautionary note to those who are listening who have both the wisdom of lived experience and are a health professional. Those are dual roles and put you in unique situations. But also can create some ethical issues. And so for those that have both the lived experience and are working in a professional capacity within healthcare, be sure that you have adequate training and supervision on when and where it's appropriate to share your story, and where and when is it best to hold that back and allow the story of the person that you're working with to emerge. So just some thoughts.
Yeah, great points. I'll just reiterate that first piece of taking the time to engage, whether it's in an actual training of recovery messaging. I saw somebody throw in the chat, Respect Institute, opportunities to write down your story and in a fashion that is going to deliver the message of connecting people, helping them believe that recovery is possible, and then walking away with an action item, even if it's just knowing that recovery is real, or that they'll change some of the language they've used in the past, or if you're advocating to a particular audience, that you're pushing that particular piece of whether it's a legislation change or financial increase for opportunities for people to recovery. Make sure that you're putting that action item there at the end. And so with that, I would say that I would ask everyone to join as a part of this campaign, follow us on social media, stay connected, and use person first, recovery focused language.
Yes, thank you all so much for your responses and such a great webinar. Before we wrap up, I do want to remind everyone to go ahead and complete the webinar survey. We'd love to just hear how everything went for you all. And again, thank you so much, Brian and Steve, for joining us, and feel free to drop your emails in the chat so people can stay connected with you all. But thank you all so much for your time.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the invitation. It's been an honor to be a part, and again to be alongside with Brian and Jody. Jody, thank you for your expertise, and Jayla and everyone at Shatterproof for putting this on. I don't see a way for me to put into the general chat. But I think that our contact information is connected to this webinar. Happy to connect with anyone. So.
One other shout out with being intentional. I just want to say thank you to Janet for helping us, for if there was anyone that was engaging to receive the sign support. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great call out, Brian. Absolutely.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.